Hi, so I'm going to talk this week for your watch. This week, I'm asking you to watch this lesson that I'm going to teach you about Mending Wall. And Mending Wall is a poem by Robert Frost. So, the first thing I want to do is read you the poem. And I'm going to teach you a strategy that we use to read a poem or approach a poem called TP Cast. It's TPCAST, and it's an acronym to help you remember the concept of how to analyze a poem. Um, and so it's just a nice acronym to use when you're analyzing a text like poem. So first thing I want to do is take a look at the poem. I just have to say, this is probably one of my favorite poems, and it's actually a poem that I quote often because it's such an interesting concept. Um, the poem Mending Wall by Robert Frost is about, well, I'll get to that, but let me go ahead and read it. Something there is that doesn't love a wall, that sends the frozen ground swell under it and spills the upper boulders in the sun and makes gaps even two can pass abreast. The work of hunters is another thing. I have come after them and made repair, where they have left not one stone on a stone, but they would have the rabbit out of hiding to please the yelping dogs. The gaps, I mean, no one has seen them made or heard them made, but at spring mending time we find them there. I let my neighbor know beyond the hill, and on a day we meet to walk the line and set the wall between us once again. We keep the wall between us as we go, to each the boulders that have fallen to each, and some are loaves and some so nearly balls. We have to use a spell to make them balance. Stay where you are until our backs are turned. We wear our fingers rough with handling them. Oh, just another kind of outdoor game, one on a side. It comes to little more. There where it is, we do not need the wall. He is all pine, and I am apple orchard. My apple trees will never get across and eat the cones under his pines. I tell him. He only says, good fences make good neighbors. Spring is the mischief in me, and I wonder if I could put the notion in his head. Why do they make good neighbors? Is it where there are cows? But here there are no cows. Before I built a wall, I'd ask to know what I was walling in or walling out, and to whom I was like to give offense. Something there is that doesn't love a wall, that wants it down. I could say elves to him, but it's not elves exactly, and I'd rather he said it for himself. I see him there bringing a stone grasped firmly by the top in each hand, like an old stone savage armed. He moves in darkness, as it seems to me, not of woods only and the shade of trees. He will not go beyond his father's saying, and he likes having thought of it so well. He says again, good fences make good neighbors. So the first thing I want to talk about is the TP cast. And TP cast, I just realized I didn't pull up another document that I wanted to show you. I can find it again. Sorry. Thanks for being patient with me. I'm so sorry that I'm making you wait for me. Okay, here it is. Good. Okay, so we're going to work through this process called the TP cast. And like I said, it's an acronym used to help you analyze a poem. Now, you don't have to go through these in this order. There isn't a magical sequence here. But I do want you to kind of use this as a guide as you're reading a poem. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to ponder the meaning of the title without reference to the poem prior to reading. Well, I already read the poem to you, so what I want to do is show you kind of how I looked at this poem before. So I'm looking at the title, just the title, and it says Mending Wall. And I know mending means fixing, and wall means a divider, or quite literally a wall. And so one question I have before I start reading this, and of course I'm pretending like I've read this, but I've read this poem like 100 times. But um, so walls are usually, I right now think about the wall that's in the news a lot, the wall that Trump wants to build in between the United States and Mexico. I think about, walls in my house that I've noticed because we've been on quarantine that have cracks in them. And then I think about mending, and mending kind of feels like an old fashioned word for fixing. I often think of mending as like something you do to fabric, like you got a hole in your pants and you want to restore them to the way that they were. So that's the first thing we do with TPcast. Now, the second thing we do is we translate the poem line by line in our own words, and you just read it at the surface level. And so I'm not going to go through the entire poem to show you. Sorry, jumping around here. I'm not going to show you, line by line for this poem because it's so long. But one thing I want to point out to you that I do when I am paraphrasing, just for me, I write down questions. So you'll notice here, what is the something? I make some notes. And then for me, paraphrasing really looks like just a summary at the end, like the line by line for me in a poem of this length, I just run out of stamina. So what I did was I recorded quotes that I think are important to the poem, and that's going to come in to play later. So one thing I wanted to talk about was something there is that doesn't love a wall, and just the idea that there's something out there that doesn't love a wall. And I want you to think about that, about how walls and fences don't stay together naturally. I have a fence in my yard right now, and as the ground freezes and the rain swells the earth, the fence posts become loose and they shift. And as they shift, the fence loses boards, and those boards have to be replaced or they have to be return to their positions. And so naturally, Earth does not support walls or fences indefinitely. Just what I know about being a homeowner, that that if I want to maintain a wall between myself and someone else, between my property and someone else's property, it takes effort. It's something I have to maintain because I can't just put it up and it'll just stay up forever. Um, so it says something there is that doesn't love a wall, that sends the frozen ground swell under it and spills the upper boulders in the sun. And so I read through this, and it talks about here about how that something happens and the wall has fallen into disrepair. And so it says, but as this at spring mending time, we find them there, these gaps made by the hunter. And he says that we don't even know, we don't see them or hear them making these gaps, but we know that they have been have made them. And so he notifies his neighbor, and we meet to walk the line. Literally, they walk the fence together and set the wall between us again. Now, what's interesting about this is, a lot of us have, like, you might have a chain link fence around your property or a wooden fence, but I had the privilege this fall when I ran a race to see one of these kinds of walls, and it was in Kentucky on a really old property. They had a wall literally made out of stones balanced on one another. And so this kind of fence relies on gravity and the weight of these stones kind of wedged together. And they build the wall up, and then they actually take flat stones and make this kind of design around the top. And this particular wall was so fragile that you couldn't, like, it was against, you would have been disqualified if you touched this wall at this race. But it was really fascinating to see. because I'd never really seen a stone wall like this in person. And if I can find a picture of it, I'll try and provide it because it's fascinating. But the neighbors walk the wall, and they put the stones back up, and they say to them, "Stay where you are until our backs are turned." And he says, "We wear our fingers rough with handling them. Just another kind of outdoor game." But he says, um, there where it is, we do not need the wall. He has pine trees, and I have an apple orchard. My apples aren't going to get up and go across and eat the pine cones under his trees. And he tells him that, and his neighbor says, this is like a little like a parable or a saying that people say. It's kind of like mind your own business. But he says, good fences make good neighbors. And I starred this because I think this is important. We'll come back to that later. But he keeps going, and he says, spring is the mischief in me. And I wonder if I could put a notion in his head. Why do they make good neighbors? So the speaker wants to be mischievous and ask his neighbor why they need this fence when they don't have cows. And he says specifically, what am I walling in or walling out? And to whom would I like to give offense? Something there is that doesn't love a wall. Whenever you in a poem see something repeated twice, it's probably important. So I'm taking note of that. That wants it down. He says, I could tell him it's elves, but it's not elves exactly. And he says, I'd rather him come to this knowledge himself. I see him there bringing a stone grasped firm by the top in each hand, like an old stone savage armed. And then he says, he moves in darkness, but it doesn't seem like the woods or the shade of the trees are creating the darkness. And he says, this man will not leave this saying, and he actually enjoys it, the idea that good fences make good neighbors. So a quick paraphrase there. And then we're going to go to the next word, and this is connotation. And we talked about this last week, but looking for deeper meaning by searching for various devices, including diction, imagery, metaphors, similes, rhyme, types of rhymes, punctuation, symbolism. So one thing I did want to point out about this poem is when you read a poem like this, and I mentioned this before, you read to the period, you read to the punctuation. So it's tempting to read it line by line. Something there is that doesn't love a wall, that sends the frozen groundswell under it. But this poem is meant to be read to the end punctuation mark. So one of the things that I noticed in terms of connotation, well, two things. I noticed that one of the things that was so interesting to me was that when he talks about his neighbor carrying the rocks right here, he says, in each hand, like an old stone savage armed. He uses, so when you use like or as, that's a simile. He's comparing his neighbor to an old stone savage, someone who is kind of unpredictable and wily, and he's armed, either with like a knife or a gun, but that the stones are actually a weapon, and that is interesting to me. Another thing that's interesting to me is that he says that this is a game that they play. He says, "Oh, just another kind of outdoor game." That this concept of them meeting at the line is one where they meet at the line and they do this kind of silly thing where they put the rocks back on top of each other. And then so I have a simile, and I have some connotation with the word savage and game. Um, and then something else I noticed, and I mentioned this earlier, was something there is that doesn't love a wall. And it kind of personifies like the mysterious thing that does not love a wall. So what is this something? And only people can love things. So it's personification here, and it's used twice. So that part must be important. Um, and then, yeah, so we'll stop there. So the next part of TP cast is attitude. Look for the author's attitude toward via the use of words. How is the writer communicating through a speaker in the poem to the reader about a particular subject or idea? And I kind of touched on that with the way that he talks about it being a game. And it's almost like, in spite of his neighbor, he chooses to go out and do this mending. He it sounds like he initiates, right? He says, I tell my neighbor, and we come on out and kind of make a game of it and put this fence back in place. But I do wonder why we're building, why we're mending this wall. Why are we keeping this wall? And it seems pretty neutral the whole time until this last couple of sentences where he describes that his neighbor is like an old stone savage who's armed, and that means that those stones are like weapons, and that he moves in darkness, as it seems to me, but not from the woods or the shade of the trees. This darkness, what is that? Does the author thinks that the act of believing that good fences make good neighbors comes from a place of darkness? And so we move from this place of it being a game to him seeing his neighbor like a savage. Um, and this idea of how his neighbor will not let go of his father's saying, and he likes having thought of it so well. So we did a quick look at attitude, and now we're going to look for shifts in tone, action, rhythm, or style. And shifts happen. Shifts happen. So when you're reading something, you always want to pay attention to the shifts. So for me, the shifts that I see here are kind of marked out, but it starts off here with the description of the gaps, and then it shifts here where he says, his neighbor comes out and joins him. And then it shifts again when he says, spring is the mischief in me, and I wonder. He shifts to his own thinking. If I could put a notion in his head, why do they make good neighbors? Isn't it where there are cows? But there are no cows. Before I built the wall, I'd ask to know what I was walling in or walling out. And you'll notice that he has his thoughts in single quotes here. And then he shifts back to how he sees his neighbor and how he thinks his neighbor would respond to him. And those shifts tell us something about this poem. And then we go back to the title. Okay, and we examine the title again now at this interpretive level. So I think that this the speaker of this poem is trying to figure out why it is that they mend this wall every spring. And he's questioning if the action of mending the wall is actually creating a barrier between his neighbor and him that is unnecessary. And so this mending wall, does mending the wall mend the relationship? Does maintaining the fence keep the relationship healthy? Does is mending the action? They're mending the wall. Is it a mending wall? A wall that exists to keep the peace? So there's all these kind of things that we can think about. And then the last thing we're going to do is go to the theme. What does the poem mean? What is it saying? How does it relate to life or human nature? So I'm going to go back to what I think is probably the most important line here is something there is that doesn't love a wall. And when Robert Frost personifies something that doesn't love a wall, and that how nature doesn't naturally support the building of these boundaries. And then the speaker also questions the necessity of these walls. I think to myself, what the wall that we keep between us as we go, and the idea of good fences making good neighbors. I think that if I start with this very last sentence, and he likes having thought of it so well, he says again, good fences make good neighbors. It was a saying that his father told him. There is a generational belief, right? That we believe things that our parents tell us, whether they're healthy for us or not, that good fences make good neighbors. And then if we build a physical boundary between us and the property beside us, that we are better neighbors because of it. And the speaker is questioning that and saying, I don't know if this wall does make us good neighbors. The act of making the wall together certainly is a little game that we play. But I wonder why we have this wall between us. I don't think that my apples are going to come over and eat your pine cones. Um, and so we have the kind of level one theme of the multi-generational belief that boundaries and barriers make relationships stronger. And then when we take this kind of a little further, we think about things that are walls, not just the physical wall that is built between these two neighbors, but what are the things, the barriers or boundaries or masks that we put between us and other people in attempts to keep our relationships healthy that might be unnecessary. And so I think that one of the themes of this poem is that the speaker is questioning if boundaries are always a healthy remedy for a relationship. Um, so that's how you do a TP cast. The one thing I didn't do kind of as explicitly that would be a lot easier to do with like Hope is a Thing with Feathers is to go line by line and paraphrase each line. But the reason I really love this poem and the reason why I like TP Cast, well, so TP Cast I think is a great tool to have in your tool belt for analyzing a piece of literature. And I really love this poem because I grapple with this idea of what are the boundaries that we have in place that we think protect our relationships, and are they necessary? And I've been thinking about that a lot right now because of our distance learning. There are a lot of boundaries that I have had in place as a teacher that have shifted, right? Like I never thought you'd see the inside of my house. Now I'm teaching from my bedroom. Um, I never thought students would have access to my cell phone. Now I have students messaging me through the Remind app. I never thought that, they're just, why do we have those boundaries? Why do we maintain distance? And now we're maintaining distance for a healthy reason. And so just the idea of why we have boundaries, why we have distance, why we maintain these boundaries and these walls or these masks, or it's just a fascinating thing to me. So I happen to believe that good fences don't make good neighbors. And I was in a neighbor's yard who lives across the street from me recently, and he just built a new home and he didn't put a fence up in his yard. And it's kind of like, this is weird, but he doesn't have a dog. And the people around him, I think, have like an electric fence or something. And he said to me, he said, "Oh, isn't it so great that I don't have a fence? It makes my yard look so much bigger." He's like, "It's so great because we all are friends anyway." And I thought that was so interesting that he really saw the benefit of not having a fence. Um, and I really, I just think sometimes that we build fences to protect ourselves um, from people seeing us as who we are. We don't want them to see too much of us. Um, and we don't want to see too much of them. And I love that Robert Frost says, I would ask the question, before I built a wall, I'd ask to know what I was walling in or walling out. And I venture to say that some of the walls that we put up isolate us in our respective properties. and we miss out on things that would be beneficial to us because we have those walls. So that's my little TP cast, a mending wall. This is, if you were in my classroom right now, I'd be all excited and animated because I love this poem and I quote it regularly. But one thing I wanted to mention was the idea of good fences make good neighbors. The speaker is using that parable, that saying, to be ironic, because he's questioning, if fences make good neighbors. So good fences. So one of your assignments this week is going to be to do a TP cast on another poem that I will send to you. But I hope you enjoy this one.